Hi, I'm Marcus Weaver-Hightower. I'm a professor at the University of North Dakota. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about grammar and specifically review some grammar terms that are helpful for doing discourse analysis. Now, the point is not to allow you to diagram a sentence in the way that you did probably when you were in 5th or 6th grade. The point really is more about knowing grammar terms to allow you to talk with others about language in discourse analysis. In discourse analysis, oftentimes we'll have to point out things about sentences, about words, about language in general, and it's helpful to have a common language that we can use to describe what those particular words are and the kind of function that they have within a sentence or within the larger discourse. Now, there's going to be two parts of or types of grammar analysis that I'll talk about, and they have a lot of overlap. The first is going to be parts of speech, and then later I'm going to talk about phrases and clauses, and they have a lot of overlap in terms of how they function within sentences. But I think I'll start with parts of speech because these are the ones that you probably learned the most about either in grade school when you were coming up, or if you learned English as a second language, the kinds of things that you might have learned about when you were in your language classes. So really, parts of speech are the similar functions of words. So we really want to think about in terms of parts of speech as being about the functions, the kinds of things that they do in a sentence. And that has to do with the syntax of a language. So parts of speech are the similar functions of words, or really lexical items. In other words, a lexicon is just the words that are available within a language, and the functions within the syntax of a language. Now, in a previous video, I talked about how syntax was about how sentences are put together. So in putting together sentences, there are lots of different kinds of functions and roles that have to go in there to be able to make meaning. Now, it's also important to remember that not all languages have the same parts of speech. So really, I'm talking about English here. All languages are going to have some kind of noun and some kind of verb, actors and actions. But beyond that, it really varies quite a lot. But in English, we have the following 8. Nouns, pronouns, adjectives, verbs, adverbs, conjunctions, prepositions, and interjections. Now, the first 3, nouns, pronouns, and adjectives, they kind of all function together in what we might call a nominal way. So in terms of subjects and objects in sentences, nouns, pronouns, and adjectives usually are kind of grouped together. Verbs and adverbs are also kind of grouped together because those are typically what we think of as kind of a predicate relationship within a sentence. So the actions and how those actions were done kind of grouped together. And then the last 3, conjunctions, prepositions, and interjections, these are really more about the syntax. They have really limited roles in terms of how they help show relationships in a sentence, and interjections in some ways kind of stand out on their own as kind of just an emotional expression. So specifically, when we think about nouns, we're talking about a person, place, thing, idea, or quality. And you can have what we call a proper noun, like Mahalia Jackson. That's going to refer to a specific person. Or we can have common nouns like usher, like an usher at a theater. You could have a place like Brisbane, Australia, which is a proper noun, a very specific place, or a more common noun like coast. You could have a thing like a bow tie, or an idea like courage. And we can also talk about a quality, something like sexiness. Pronouns, then, are a second part of speech that we use to substitute for a noun or a noun phrase. So he or it, instead of saying Bob, which is a noun, we could use he, which is a pronoun. We can also show plurality, so like we can kind of encompass lots of different people by saying them. And we can also be more indefinite by saying someone or anyone or everyone. Adjectives then are going to qualify or describe a noun or noun phrase. So you could describe a girl or a dress or a house by saying it's pretty. You could describe a girl by saying she's courageous. But you could also qualify it and say we have a few girls, so how many can also be a question we answer with adjectives. So those first three, nouns, pronouns, and adjectives, again, are kind of in the nominal part of a sentence. And then we shift to verbs. This is where we start to show what those subjects, those nouns that we were talking about in pronouns, are doing. So a verb is a word or phrase that gives an action, an occurrence, or a state of being. And a very simple action would be run. Jane runs. But then something like an occurrence, like happens, is not really an action per se. It's an event more so. And then we have the to be verbs, be, been, being, is, am, are, was, were. All of those words are really more about showing existence rather than activity. Adverbs then are kind of a catch-all in some ways syntactically because they can do so many things. They can be a qualifier of an adjective, of a verb. They can qualify a clause, an entire sentence, or even other adverbs. A very common one is this word very. It's just kind of emphasis, talking about how something is being done. Commonly, you'll also find adverbs ending in ly, slowly. How did she run? Slowly. Now, conjunctions are one of those types of speech, parts of speech, that really almost only serve a function of syntax. To a certain degree, they can also do things pragmatically or semantically, but in terms of just the syntax, they tend just to connect other parts of speech. They connect phrases or they connect clauses. So you might have two verbs put together with a conjunction. She ran and jumped. And there is a conjunction that joins those two verbs together. Mark and Jesse. You have two nouns put together with a conjunction. Or you can put two clauses together. We watched, but he never came. But there being the conjunction that joins those two clauses. We watched and he never came. Now I have a fun little mnemonic device that you can use for the most common conjunctions in English. Now there are others, but these are the ones that you'll most commonly see, particularly joining two clauses together, and that is fanboys. And fanboys stands for and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. The most common of the conjunctions in English. Prepositions are the next part of speech, and these establish relationships in time and space, or they establish relationships of belonging, not necessarily in a sense of possession, though it can be, but possession and or just kind of a grouping, or that they belong together in some senses. One of the most common would be of. So the top of the hour, of, is showing that relationship between top and hour. Top is a part of the hour. So a sense of belonging. It can also show space, under, above, beyond. It can show time, before, after, during, all those kinds of words. Those are prepositions that show relationships in time and space, or a relationship of belonging. And then finally, the interjection, which is kind of a strange part of speech in that these are generally just kind of off on their own. They don't sort of work together necessarily with other parts of speech to, change the syntax, but they're kind of emotional exclamations that don't have a different kind of function. So it could be something like, huzzah! There's no proposition being made there. There's no subject doing an action. It's just a kind of exclamation, or boy. So again, I started by telling you that we're going to talk about two different things, parts of speech and phrases. And again, parts of speech are what we talk about with lexical structure. In other words, we're talking about words, individual words, and how they function within a particular sentence. But when we do a phrasal analysis, we're talking about larger syntactic structures, so groups of words that in some ways are inseparable from each other because they kind of give one chunk of meaning that serve a function within the sentence. So phrases are about sort of chunks of words and how they function as a chunk together. Phrases oftentimes will get confused with another term, clauses. Sometimes you'll have heard these two things talked about together, but there's a distinction that's kind of important when we talk about discourse analysis. Phrases are groups of words that can have a syntactic role, a grammatical function. Now, so it's important to say that that doesn't mean just any kind of random words that are stuck together, but the words that actually naturally cohere together kind of as chunks of language, that those chunks, when put together, have a grammatical function. Clauses, on the other hand, are slightly different in that they're a group of words that are a complete proposition, a complete thought, if you will. So they could be sentences by themselves. So it would have to have a noun phrase and a verb phrase within it to be considered a clause, because it would have to be a full thought or a full sentence. But we're thinking mostly about phrases here, and sometimes phrases can be a clause, but generally speaking, those two things are going to be distinct. In English, we have 5 different kinds of phrases: noun phrases, verb phrases, adjective phrases, adverb phrases, and prepositional phrases. You'll note that these are almost exactly the same kinds of words, concepts that we were talking about before when we were talking about parts of speech. There's a lot of overlap here, as I said before, because the function is really what we're interested in. A noun phrase functions like a noun. A verb phrase functions like a verb. An adverb phrase functions like an adverb. So things like conjunction, there's no such thing as a conjunction phrase. There's no such thing necessarily as an interjection phrase. It's really about how these things function, and those syntactic functions don't really apply here. So let's look at these individually. We'll start with noun phrases. So you could have something like cardiac patients, the girl with the red hair, the last house on the left of Elm Street. As you can see, these noun phrases are chunks that fit together. They are kind of singular ideas, singular people, that kind of thing. Noun phrases then are going to contain the nouns, but also all of the determiners, a, an, or the, this, that, these, those. Those are all what we call determiners. Any adjectives, adverbs, and prepositional phrases that link with the noun to create a singular kind of chunk of information. So for instance, cardiac patients, that's an adjective, cardiac, and a noun, patients, that function together as one thing. Cardiac patients are one thing. The girl with the red hair, right, there's determiners in there. The girl, that's a noun. With the red hair, that's a prepositional phrase, but those words chunk together to function like a singular noun, the girl with the red hair. And it's the same with the last one. Here we have multiple prepositional phrases going on in there. The last house, on the left, of Elm Street, that whole set of words, that whole phrase functions as a single noun. It's one single house, but there's more description that goes in there with it. With verb phrases, it's going to be similar. It's going to be any action plus its object. Finished his dinner. Finished what? His dinner. So finished his dinner is the verb phrase there. It's a group of words that functions as a verb. May see a whale. That word may is what we call a modal. It's kind of a conditional word that is tacked on to a verb to inflect its meaning in some way. Oftentimes, like with the last one, will not be given up, it can convey a tense. So in the future, will. Now, will not be given up is another interesting one because it's got what we call a phrasal verb in it. Given up is a phrasal verb because it's a single verb made up of two different words, given up. So you know as a speaker that to give something is different from to give up something. When you want to say give up, you have to have that preposition up in there with give because that's part of the meaning. So you can't really necessarily do without those. That's what we call a phrasal verb, where more than one word forms one verb idea. So you can kind of stack all of those words together to make a verb phrase. With an adjective phrase, it's an adjective plus any adverbs and prepositional phrases that cohere together with that adjective to work together as a single sort of adjective part of the sentence. Now there's two different types. You can have attributive adjective phrases, which is kind of part of a noun phrase and it modifies the noun. So like with that first one, you could have a sentence like, being angry with her is all he could think about all day. That phrase together, being angry with her, being is actually in that sense a noun, or being angry, but angry is an adjective that's going to modify the noun. And with her is going to be a prepositional phrase that works together with it as an adjectival phrase. Or you can have, so that's the attributive adjective phrase, or you can have a predicative adjective phrase, which would come after a state of being verb, is, am, are, was, were, be, been, being, not within a noun phrase. So he is angry with her would be more predicative because angry with her is an adjective that describes he, right? He is angry with her. Adverb phrases are kind of interesting. There's something incredibly interesting about adverbs in general, just because there's so many aspects to them. But an adverb phrase doesn't actually have to have an adverb in it. It just has to act in an adverbial way. So again, this is where we start to see the distinction between phrases and parts of speech. In an adverb phrase, again, it doesn't have to have an adverb, but it has to sort of function syntactically as an adverb. And that means it has to answer questions like when, where, or how. So talking about time, space, or manner. So if we think about something like too soon, that's when. Near the school gate, that's where. Very haltingly, that's how or a manner. And in an hour is again when. And that last one, in an hour, you'll note it's actually a prepositional phrase, but in a sentence like, he finished the race in an hour. He finished the race when? In an hour. So it's answering that question when, and even though it doesn't have an adverb in it, it functions adverbially in that sentence, so it is an adverb phrase. So it's a little more complicated to pick some of these out sometimes because you have to think about function rather than individual words. And then, of course, prepositional phrases. These are going to almost always start with the preposition and follow with a noun and any of the modifiers of that particular noun. So prepositions, remember, talk about relationships of space, time, and belonging. So over the ridge, right? Over is a preposition. Ridge is a noun. The is a determiner. And so that together is a prepositional phrase, a group of words that functions as a preposition. Now you can also stack prepositional phrases together that will function as a single prepositional phrase, like in the crook of her very hairy arm, right? That's one sort of object, one kind of thing. In the crook of her very hairy arm. That's one location, if you will, but it's got two prepositional phrases that construct it together. And again, we want to think in terms of how these chunks of information function much more so than what the specific words are within it, and that helps us see how the overall sentence is working together. So speaking of overall sentences and working together, with any sentence, right? If we have or clause, we have to have a noun phrase and a verb phrase for it to be comprehensible, right? It has to have at the very least a noun phrase and a verb phrase. If you're missing either one of those, it won't be understandable. The only exception being that if there's what we call an understood subject or an understood verb, that generally is going to mean that somewhere else in the discourse there's a referent. It might be left out in the explicit sentence, but there's an understanding between speakers of what's being talked about. So in a way that verb phrase or that noun phrase is still there. It's just located elsewhere in the conversation. So you could have something very simple to have a comprehensible sentence like he ate. Technically speaking, those are noun phrases, he, and a verb phrase, ate, even though they're singular words. That is a comprehensible sentence. But most sentences, of course, are going to be a little more complicated than that. You're going to have lots of different phrases and clauses and other words in there that kind of group together. And being able to break those down helps us understand more about what the discourse is doing. So if we were going to do a sort of clause analysis, this sentence, he ate with gusto, and as he did, the pungent taste overtook his senses, has two clauses joined together with a conjunction. Clause 1, he ate with gusto. That is a complete proposition. It's a complete thought. It could be, if you wanted to, a complete sentence by itself. So is clause 2, as he did, the pungent taste overtook his senses. That could be a complete sentence. We take those two and join them together with a conjunction, and that conjunction, in some senses, shows a relationship between them, an attitude, those kinds of things. Now, to do a phrase or part of speech analysis is a little more complicated. And again, I don't expect that you're going to go through and be able to do all of these things in any particular sentence that you're looking at just off the top of your head. But at least understanding how these sentences are put together can be very important within a discourse analysis. So if you look there at the bottom, there's the sentence, he ate with gusto, and as he did, the pungent taste overtook his senses. We could, at a very simple level, look at each individual word and pick out its part of speech. So that middle row of labels shows what those parts of speech are. We have a pronoun to start the sentence, he. We would probably have a reference somewhere else in our conversation or in the text that we're looking at that says who he is. He might be someone named Thomas, right? Ate is a verb. With gusto, that's a preposition and a noun, and together that prepositional phrase actually works as an adverb, right? It talks about how he ate. So that verb phrase altogether is a verb, an adverbial phrase made up of a prepositional phrase. There's a conjunction, and as he did is an adverb, a pronoun, and a verb. They function together as an adverbial phrase. The pungent taste, that's a noun phrase made up of a determiner, an adjective, and a noun. And overtook his senses, that's a verb phrase that is composed of a verb, a pronoun, and a noun. So we can break down all of those by parts of speech, but we could also, again, looking at the top row, look at how it's put together phrasally. So a noun phrase and a verb phrase with a conjunction. The second clause is going to have an adverb phrase, a noun phrase, and a verb phrase all together. Again, the importance is not necessarily that you be able to go through and do a diagram of a sentence, but if you see an adjective in a sentence, it's really helpful to be able to say that it's an adjective and to be able to describe its function within the sentence. Or if you're reading somebody else's work, to be able to, when they say, this noun phrase, or talking about how a particular speaker uses verb phrases in some interesting way, to be able to talk about or to understand how these pieces work together syntactically and the kinds of function that these words use. So I hope you've learned something and gotten a good review of the grammar for when you're looking at your discourse analysis to come.